Just wait for my guest. Just wait for my guest. Test 1, 2. Two, 1, 1, 2. Freedom, freedom. Still got 3 minutes. James, can you hear me?
I can hear you well. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hear me now? Interesting. Can you hear me
Mm,
now?
I can hear you now.
How clear is that? I'm not sure if I'm on my proper mic.
Oh, yeah, crystal clear.
Oh, perfect. How's your morning time Australia, right?
I am, yeah. So you're in Mexico at the moment, is that right?
I am. I'm in Puerto Vallarta on the Pacific coast of Mexico. So it's cold in New York in the winter. So
Fair enough.
um, but yeah, I had to look through the questions. Everything's clear. Happy to talk about any of that.
Oh,
So
good.
yeah,
Sweet. Should get the show on the road.
cool. About how long?
Shouldn't go to no longer than 20, 25 minutes.
Okay, good.
Depends how
Um,
long your answers are and if I pick up something.
sure, no worries.
Yeah. Right. Questions up here. Right. If we just wait for the countdown and we'll be live.
Perfect.
Hi, folks. Welcome back. And today we're joined by James Mcqualter. And he lives in New York, but this time of the year is in Mexico. And James, thanks for coming on to the show. And first and foremost, can you quickly just give a rundown on what you're all about?
Yeah, no, and appreciate the invite, and appreciate the invite, Dave. Yeah, so I'm from Ireland originally, grew up on a farm there, and then worked in technology the last 15 years. And in particular, in the last year, I've been working on how do you convert the food system to be low carbon.
Hmm.
It's not a easy task. There's a lot of very smart people working on it. And so I've been looking at a number of different approaches and have gone pretty deep into everything from regenerative agriculture to lab-based meat to a few other approaches. And so, yeah, and so I'm working on a few different projects in that space and we'll hopefully build a startup on the basis of whichever of those approaches is most successful.
Yeah, of course. And first and foremost, the question that everyone wants to ask: why meat?
Yeah, so I think lab-grown meat is this super interesting technology. And the way I think about like why any technology is it's applicable to any type of technology.
Mm,
Somebody invented it. About 8 years ago, we had this first burger produced that was eaten. I think it was in Holland, and that was about a $300,000 burger.
mm,
It made all this kind of media frenzy around it, and obviously people can't be affording $300,000 burgers, but the dramatic kind of decrease in cost over those last 8 years means that we're basically imminently going to see this, in front of people, in front of consumers. And so the fact that the technology has followed the decline in cost that we see in other types of technology, right? Things like computers or
mm.
renewable energy have also followed a very similar cost curve. But lab grown meat in particular has gone very, very quickly and become very cheap very quickly.
Yeah, it is really fascinating stuff, and really interested in it. So, how does lab-grown meat compare to, say, the plant-based meat we're seeing, like the Impossible Burgers, the Beyond Burgers of this world?
Yeah, so both lab-based meat and plant-based meat are taking a those companies have been found. So I mentioned, the why in terms of the technology coming down and being cheaper. But I
Mm,
suppose the mission of a lot of the people actively working on this, a lot of the companies, is generally driven from two principles. So one is around animal welfare and the other is around climate and sustainability. And so both plant-based and lab-based, approaches are saying, look, the way we treat animals in the modern farming is pretty horrific by and large. And so we need to reduce the massive amount of animal cruelty occurring in the food system. And so if you just don't have animals at all, like plant-based, or you don't have animals directly involved in the production of, the, the muscle that goes into a burger or something like that, in the case of lab-based, you're removing animal suffering. And then the second piece is around land use. And so, I think a lot of people are familiar with this idea of, cow burps and farts and all this kind of thing,
mm,
the methane. Um, you know, Basically, if agriculture is basically directly accountable for about 20% of global emissions. If livestock, counting beef, cattle, pigs, etc., were counted as a country, they'd probably be the #2 emitter in the world globally. And so there's a huge amount of interest from a sustainability point of view to see, is there a way to produce meat, produce protein, produce things that were, socially primed to eat, right? Like if you've been eating a steak or a certain type of dish your entire lives, and you don't really feel the drive to be vegan, how can you replace that in a way that doesn't have such a profound effect on the climate? And so those are the two primary principles for what's driving the interest. The plant-based, it's basically about 5 to 10% of the market in certain areas. So around burgers and sausages and so on. In certain countries, it's become that large. In other countries, it's not even 1%. And the big advantage with plant-based is, personally, I think, is mostly on the animal cruelty point of view. I grew up on a farm. We had an organic farm. The animals were treated very well. I was a butcher. I literally have no ethical quandary over the animals that I raised, slaughtered, butchered, all those kind of things, because the animal actually had a great time the entire way through. Whereas, industrialized like meat production today is nothing like that. The animals were kept in pretty horrific conditions. Often it's illegal to even film the conditions animals are put in. And so plant-based is saying, look, these animals aren't involved at all. The downside with a lot of the plant-based approach is, to be honest, is kind of health and environmental. To try to get the texture, the mouthfeel of like a burger is quite difficult with just fat, plant-based fats and proteins. And so there's quite a bit of sodium, quite a bit of soy and things that aren't ideal to be consumed in massive quantities by people. And so I'll eat Beyond Burgers. I've had all these burgers. I'm basically a pescatarian at this point. I'll eat, beef when I can, source it correctly. But I think these are like not the world's healthiest type solutions.
Yes.
And then on the lab-based side, I think it tries to solve both problems pretty well. So it definitely has a similar advantage to the animal cruelty. To get started, there was definitely, animals involved, but once you start figuring out things like the growth culture being made in a non-animal dependent way, it's pretty cruelty free. And then the health, I mean, it's basically should be genetically identical to the original thing. So it's as healthy as any burger that already exists. So again, you shouldn't be eating too many of those anyways. And then the climate piece is pretty profound. Now we can say that lab-based meat will be 99% less climate impacting than traditional like meat production. We don't really know that yet because we haven't really scaled it up, and so that number could come down. But when you're playing around with numbers that large, right, that it could come down in the 90+% range, it's pretty exciting. So,
which how exactly is lab-grown meat made, James?
Yeah, so and I think this is going to be the big struggle with lab-grown meat. How do you explain it and get people to engage with it in a way that doesn't have a yuck factor? Because it's a pretty lab-based, it's in the name, I guess, process. And so basically, you take some cells from an animal, from a cow, a pig, whatever it may be, and then you take those cells and you put them in what they call a bioreactor.
Yeah.
And if you think about a bioreactor, it's kind of like it's like a big tank, something that you might brew beer in or something similar, lots of pipes going in and out of it. And this is in essence, for one of a better metaphor, kind of like, the womb, right, for growing and developing. And so then you add a medium. And so the medium is typically some sort of nutrient broth or something similar. They've used, to get this technology up and running, we were using bovine fetal cells for a lot of this, and that did have an animal cruelty effect, but a lot of companies have started to move away from that now. And basically just feed all these nutrients in, the tissue grows, it develops, and eventually you have something that, is akin to the original type of meat. It can then be processed in other ways and produced, and then sold. One other step is starting to become more kind of popular, and that's basically building a kind of a scaffolding using something like 3D printing, something similar to that, to like build up a steak. And so the original concepts for this lab grown meat were things that are kind of smushy, right? So like burgers and chicken nuggets and this kind of thing. Now there's like a huge amount of work being done into like recreating like a T-bone steak,
Yeah.
and so you're basically slowly building that up within these
Wow.
bioreactors.
Yeah. So I heard in the background research on lab grown meat that lab grown meat is also very well. How can I say there's less bacteria and can actually be eaten. So you wouldn't eat a raw chicken, but you can eat raw. Is that correct? Because I think it's all hygienically sealed and everything like that.
Yeah, so the one of the big sources of things like E. coli outbreaks and
Mm.
issues within food safety is the fact that again the traditional meat industry has a lot of animals living in very close quarters to each other, often living in their own feces, and then they're then sent to abattoir, and there's like this whole process, and often the animals are just kind of basically sprayed down in bleach to kill salmonella and all that kind of thing. With lab grown beef, you're not going to have anything like that, right? Because basically you're only growing the muscle in essence. You're not
Yes.
growing the digestive tract or anything else. And so the contamination risks from like a foodborne pathogen are basically nil. There might be other things that can always happen in a lab, but any lab that is worth its salt and following proper hygiene procedures,
Mm.
there shouldn't really be any problems with that.
Yeah. And just onto a new topic. Is there a difference between proponents of regenerative agriculture and lab grown meat industry?
Yeah, so I suppose I'll speak a little bit about regenerative agriculture. So, regenerative agriculture is basically an alternative approach to changing how we, create food.
Yeah.
And so, again, this traditional manner of food is very industrialized. It produces a ton of food, right? So, like, that has basically allowed population growth and a higher standard of living in large parts of the world. And so the green revolution that industrialized agriculture brought was a result of, I think on net has definitely been a positive for the world, but it had a massive cost, and that was both on the animal cruelty side but also on the climate side. And so basically what we've been doing for 50 to 100 years is degrading the soil, degrading water, and a few other things. And so what regenerative agriculture does is it implement certain practices that are more akin to how we used to farm before we had industrialized farming. And this means like you plant multiple things together, you don't plow or till up the soil as often, and a few other practices. But this is a way basically to make the soil become a net sequesterer of
Mm.
carbon, and so it can take carbon back out of the atmosphere. And this is something that the IPCC and all the climate groups are very excited by. This is my personal interest is
Yeah.
quite in that direction at the moment. And but what I suppose kind of raises kind of interesting tension is that in the lab grown meat kind of community and the startups working in this space, the claim is we'll move away from like basically having animals on the land at all, right? And people in the regenerative ag space would say like this is a massive mistake, because if you think about again the planet as a series of ecosystems, before humans came along, there were large herbivores moving around. We still see them in certain parts of the world, like in sub-Saharan Africa. You see elephants and giraffe and zebra
Yes.
and all this kind of thing. And so we basically wiped those out and replaced them with cattle in the likes of Australia or the United States or Canada. And so, even in a world of lab grown meat where all of our protein is sourced by lab grown meat, to actually maintain like ecosystem balance and not have the soil degrade and climate issues, we basically still need millions of animals like just interacting with the ecosystem. And so whether they're going to be cattle or we have a return to bison in North America, or some other animal that was originally local, or again maybe we just use sheep and cattle and animals that we already have a relationship with, is I think an open question. But I think the lab grown meat community sometimes has less of an understanding of how farming happens and the
Mm.
positive aspects of farming. And so that transition period I think is going to be very, very important, because if it goes off the rails, which these things can, you could have enough blowback from the agriculture and food space that it could actually derail lab grown meat getting widespread adoption on a time frame that I think is reasonable.
Yeah, interesting. Very much because I guess you've seen that Woody Harrelson documentary about soil.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
there's a few great ones. Like,
yeah,
people should just look up soil on Netflix, and you'll find some good ones.
yeah. Because that's the whole point about it. Is just regenerate the carbon. I think it's interesting. We could probably do both. We could have, say, lab grown meat and put a lot of like agroforestry with, you know, rotating the crops, having the animals. Yeah, you can have both worlds. I think you can't just, yeah, it's just a very interesting point there.
Yeah, and I think like any set of community, right, like has their perspective on it, and
Mm,
and people sometimes people are wrong, right? Like
yeah,
again, like I think industrialized traditional like the type of industrialized farming we have is just like a bad system on pretty much every metric today, and so it needs to be like there needs to be a revolution that occurs to change that. And if 20% of that is in one direction, and then some of that's plant-based replacement, some of that is lab-grown meat replacement, some of that is regenerative farming, some of that is
mm,
just people have a more varied diet that's maybe more plant-based.
yes,
In general, I think all of those things can kind of impact this in various ways. But I suppose and this is always like a boring answer, but like it's multiple answers to the one question.
mm,
It's not going to just be one thing, and I don't think lab grown meat is a silver bullet. And again, the speed of adoption of these things, if you go too fast, there could be a rejection of society, and maybe you don't get a chance to do it again for 10 years. And
yeah,
actually, that's what we're seeing right now. And so, lab grown meat has been ready to go for about 2 years, I would say, definitely in the last 12
wow,
months. I've talked to people in the space. They're like, it's the people they're like, who's going to go first, right? And so we actually just had the first application for consumption in Singapore last December. And so, we're imminently, I would say, going to see it on shelves. I would say definitely by 2025 in the United States and Australia and in some other countries, we're going to probably see lab grown meat products on shelves or in restaurants. And then it'll start to kind of grow from there.
yeah. Like I said, no, my questions coming up, but there are currently, as I read in background research, 7 states in the US have banned
Mm.
lab grown meat from being called meat. What sort of strategies are you going to get around that? How are you going to rename it or rebrand it so you can avoid this sort of legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think milk is like a really interesting case here, and the alternative milks like oat milk, almond milk, and coconut milk, etc. Like coconut milk, you're allowed to call that coconut milk in Mexico, for example, but you're not allowed to call that milk in Europe.
Mm,
Milk comes from a dairy cow, and that was decided in an EU law in 2017. And so, if you're a company like Oatly who produces, tons of like oat milk, and Europe is a massively growing segment for them. I was talking to somebody at the kind of large company called Danone, which produces tons of dairy and yogurts and so on, and they are producing a ton of alternative milks now as well. And so it's by far the fastest growing segment. It's about 10% of the market in the United States and Europe now compared to dairy, and so you're seeing this slow curve downward of cow sourced milk, I guess we'll call it, and then alternative milks are starting to replace that. And so I would say those lessons are pretty interesting. So again, some countries or multi countries have just banned the use of the word milk, but those products are still being bought. And so I think that there'll be a slow early adoption, and then there'll be these things will grow from a low base rapidly. So even if they're growing 5, 10, 15% a year, like they'll start very low and it'll seem like they're not there at all. But then within 10 years, like they're taking a meaningful segment of the market. And I think we're going to see something very, very similar for lab grown meat. Because I suppose there's two kind of classifications of prevention. So one is consumer demand. Um, you know, like nobody until somebody goes first, like we don't really know, will consumers reject this, right? Like Europeans do not eat GMO foods, like genetically modified foods, whereas Americans do and a lot of other countries do, because there was basically a distaste for those things. And also its linkages with certain companies and so on meant that people never really adopted and basically banned GMOs in Europe, whereas everybody eats GMOs all the time in the United States and most of the rest of the world. You could well see something similar with lab grown meat, where certain regulatory environments or certain reactions by the public kind of interact with each other in various ways, so that you'll maybe be able to get lab grown meat in Texas, Actually, probably not Texas because they have such a large,
Yes.
livestock. But somewhere like Maine, maybe, where they have no, from my understanding, no cows. But you'll be able to get it there, but not in Texas.
Yeah.
You may not be able to get it in Ireland, but you might be able to get it in South Africa or wherever it is. And so it'll be like that for a while. But then eventually, all of those dominoes will fall as well, and people will
Okay,
will
interesting.
buy it. And even if it doesn't say the word meat, I think people get what it is pretty quickly.
Yeah. And that brings us nicely to our last question, and all about the future. Where do you see
Mhm.
the future of food lie, and can we see more different alternative sources of foods and fruit, insects for food? In your humble opinion, where you see it?
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And there's, I suppose, the first thing, like the private venture community is starting to pour a lot of money into basically what they call the future of food. It's If you look at the amount of VC dollars going in, it's dramatically increasing. Insect protein is one massive growth area. There has been multi, 10 and $100 million investments in companies in that space, either through insect protein being fed for humans and for human consumption. A lot of companies are also using it as a way to make cheaper food for livestock and go back into the traditional kind of livestock system. So I think I'm probably a little bit more negative on insect protein specifically because I think that it's a pretty large jump for some cultures more than others.
Mm,
Again, I think in the West it'll be more difficult, but
yeah,
people have been eating crickets in Mexico for thousands of years, and you can go to certain restaurants here and even in Mexico and get crickets if you want them, and so that's not that big a deal here. I think the other things like indoor farming and there are a number of other, we already talked about regenerative ag, but I think like the big aspect of the future of food that kind of sums up all these kind of technological developments is the shortening of supply chains. And so
yes,
as we saw during COVID, you know, long supply chains cause problems, cause shortages, and if you have disruption, you can have a lot of trouble. And so things like vertical farming, things like lab grown meat, plant-based meat to a certain extent, allow food to be grown closer to the people who are consuming it. And so I think a world where you have these shortened supply chains, we have, the opportunity to eat local. I think those are the technologies that encourage that. Those are the ones that I would be most kind of happy to kind of bet on.
absolutely, I totally agree. And finally, James, is there anything I didn't ask but should?
Yeah, no, I think I suppose the only thing I was like when I'm thinking about it, like a specific new technology like this, is like whoever's listening to this and you're thinking about lab grown meat, I suppose it's always important to kind of question what your immediate reaction is. So like if your immediate reaction is like, oh, that's the coolest thing ever, it's worth always be like, oh, like why did I think that was super cool? Like what aspect of it is interesting relative to the ways I eat meat today? How might it change my behavior? But equally, if it's like, oh, that sounds disgusting, I'd never eat that. Like also question that. Like why do you have that reaction? Like how deeply do you understand where the things you eat today come from?
Mm,
If you knew that in more
yeah,
depth, maybe you'd also have a similar reaction. And so I think, I'm always trying to like, I suppose, question myself, like, why do I have a reaction? And, I have my strong opinions like anybody else, as I'm sure people heard today. But, I'm always trying to say, okay, even if I very much believe a certain thing, like question why I believe that so that, at least at minimum, I have a good answer for it. So that's all I'd
yeah,
say.
yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, as a food change, just look at seafood. I mean, once upon a time, oil for poor people now,
Absolutely.
finest restaurants, and so things do change over time. And James, thank you very much for coming onto the show. Finally, where can we find you?
Yeah, so I have my own kind of podcast where I talk to people. I have a few episodes with founders in the lab grown meat space. It's called Carbotnik. Hopefully, we can add that to the show notes.
Hmm.
And yeah, I'm working on a few projects in the regenerative ag space. Nothing to announce yet. I'm waiting on some grant news from a couple of large organizations, and if those come off, we're going to build something pretty cool, and I'll make that announcement then. But anybody who's interested in this space can always kind of reach out to me. You can kind of basically see it in my on my podcast page and email me there.
Fantastic. I'll make sure those in the show notes, folks. And there we have.
Thank you very much, Dave.
No worries. Just wait. That was great. This will come out on the 15th of April.
Cool. Great. Yeah, just let me know a little bit
Yeah.
beforehand. I'll do some cross posting and all that.
Yeah.
Um, and we'll go from there. And yeah, no, great questions. Like it's a super fun topic, and yeah, let me know if I can do anything to help.
Yeah, no, it's certainly piqued my interest. Even vertical farming has piqued my interest. So I'm really keen to go further down this rabbit hole. So yeah.
Wicked.
Hmm.
Well, it's getting late in Mexico, but have a good morning, and
Yep.
yeah, I'm sure we'll chat again soon.
No worries. It's all good. And buenas noches.
Cheers, you too.
Yeah.
Have a good one. Bye now.
Bye.